Hello, everyone. Good evening. My name is Shweta. I work with the Godrej Archives, and I welcome you all to the launch of From Frugal to the Ornate. I'm really happy to see you all here. I invite Head of Godrej Archives, Ms. Vrunda Pathare, to introduce the archives itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Shweta. And welcome all of you on behalf of Godrej Archives, HANU, as well as Bangalore International Center. And I can't really believe that we have done this second book now on the object. And Sarita was always part of these projects that we keep doing about the objects and the material culture of it. So I really can't believe. So thank you, all of you, for coming here. And that's a great inspiration for us to do such projects more. So I would just quickly tell you about the Godrej Archives. So Godrej started thinking about setting up the archives way back in 1997 when they were celebrating centenary. And Saurabh Godrej, the then chairman of Godrej Group of Companies, he envisioned archives to be a heritage center offering invaluable archival material for reference and research. But we formally started only in 2006, and now Godrej Archives aims at preserving 125 years history of Godrej Group of Companies. Godrej Group of Companies turned 125 this year only, so this is a really great occasion for us to even launch this book in this year. And Godrej Archives also aims at unfolding the contribution made by Godrej to the industrial history of India as well as country's future. And when we started actually collecting, our collection is a usual thing, like, the company documents, the agreements, even like lots of correspondence that the company keeps doing. But what really interested us is when we started looking at the product catalogs, product drawings, advertisements, testimonials about the products. It also really made us think about how actually the material culture also has evolved over a period of time, how even the consumption patterns have evolved over time. And we realized that Godrej history is not just about the company, but it is also about the designers, about the manufacturers. It is also about the engineers, managers, everyone who has contributed, even the workers who have worked on the machine. It is also the history of machines that we had to look at, the tools that Godrej made. So it was really very intriguing for us. And then we really thought that, Godrej history wasn't really, untouched by whatever was happening around in the country as well as globally. And we really found it very amazing to explore all the influences, inspirations, and impact all these developments, may it be social, political, economical, these developments had on Godrej's history. And that's what we started exploring. And therefore, over the years, the archives started engaging with researchers, academicians, even designers, artists, to explore various facets of this business history. And through research fellowships, lectures, talks, and we also started, exploring the material culture of India. And our first attempt to look at the material culture was in 2016, and with the book titled With Great Truth and Regard, Story of the Typewriter in India. And this was really amazing because in the year 2009, Godrej stopped manufacturing the manual typewriters. And we realized that when this news actually was spread in the newspaper, people really started reminiscing about this typewriter. And we started getting lots of stories, through the newspapers about what really typewriter meant for India. And that's when Godrej thought that, okay, this is the time that we should look at this product, and Godrej Archives thought we will give a tribute to this product by writing history of India through the lens of this product. And that's when actually we met Sarita, who got associated with us for designing this lovely book. And she really created this amazing experience of the typewriter world through mere design, and it was the pangrams and even the smudges on the pages, carbon paper, everything really made this book really very interesting. And that's when we also started enjoying and engaging with history in a really more exciting ways. And and then of course she also helped us setting up and curating our permanent exhibition at Vikroli in Mumbai, which is Back to the Future. And it's a complete 125 years history of Godrej in a very interesting ways, because Sarita really blended technology, with all these historical objects and documents that we had. So we had Kindles in our exhibition, and it was really amazing because we also learned to look at history in more like engaging way and how to make it interesting for people. So thank you, Sarita, for that. And that's when we started discussing about her project, and she was already doing the research on seating in India. And we thought this is the great opportunity because after typewriter, we were thinking what we will do next. And this is the product, chair, which is a quite a ubiquitous object. We sit on it every day. Right now also we are doing that, but we never really think about it. Of course, I'm talking from the layman's point of view. There are a lot of designers who might be thinking about chair every day. But that's how it is, and that's when actually we thought about this book. So again, thank you, Sarita, for being associated with us for these many years and giving us this opportunity to look at Indian history through the object's point of view. So without much ado, I would like to now call Sarita Sundar, who actually wear many hats: visualizer, designer, writer, researcher, and also founder of Hano, to come here and speak to us. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Vrinda. I'm going to keep this really, really short. I think we should reserve the time that we have for this very exciting panel of people that we have who will sort of talk about things that are part of the book, things that are not outside of the book, and things that in various ways, in the ways in which they've engaged with the seat or with the chair and things like that. The panel is made up of a design theorist, a design practitioner, manufacturer, and patrons. So it's, in a sense, the sort of perfect sort of a cocktail of academia meets research meets practice. It could well, have the potential of being something that can combust into an argumentative sort of discussion. But I can truly assure you that it can also be a wonderful alchemy, having sort of worked with a few sort of different disciplines and, historians and things like that. For me, this project has meant that I've had the good fortune to interact with a number of different people through these last 7 years. And I think that's really the wonderful thing about this project. There have been people who've sort of believed in this vision and have sort of supported me in various ways. And I have to say that I'm really humbled by my good fortune here, and I'd like to use this opportunity to, because I don't think I'm going to come back on the stage, for at least by myself, so I want to use this opportunity to thank Vrinda firstly, and also Mrs. Firoza Godrej, who saw some sort of potential in that little scrap of an essay that I had shared with them in 2015, I think, 2015, and it was around 2018 that we sort of got into the project with a bit more steam. Other than they themselves, the whole team at the archives have been sort of very, very wonderful in supporting me with the research. Shweta, Soumya here, Amrita, Sudha, Kishore, and Chandrakant, to just name a few of the people. And my team in Hano, when I say team, it sounds like a team. We're really not a team. But I'd really like to thank Georgie somewhere here, who's, while he's listed as the sort of co-designer of the book, I think he's been much more than that. He's, read through the manuscript, looked at gaps, and sort of really helped in sort of taking the content and making it accessible, making history sort of more accessible with really wonderful infographics that you can see both within the book, on the poster, as well as on the website. Then we've had a number of sort of interns who've sort of come in, Dhanisha, Savitri, Soumya, Tiara, to name a few. And we've had photographers, we've had designers, some of whom are here, who've shared very, very freely of their imagery, of their sort of objects. Even this exhibition was really put together in quite, with so much support from everybody. So I'm sort of really happy and thankful, because I think all of these have enriched this project so much. All I'd like to do right now is just to read a very, very small extract from the book. It kind of conveys a little bit as to how my interest in material culture has come about. Goes back to my grandfather. I think all of us will probably have stories of our grandfather. A lot of people who I've spoken to who have often spoken to me about their grandfather's chair. So it goes like this. During the course of this project, I have tested many seats. It was, however, while testing one such seat, a seat which had a personal significance for me, that I became aware that perhaps my keen interest in material culture and objects, to ferret out why they take the shape they take, who conceived them to be this way or that, what gave these things agency and why, might well have emerged from my grandfather's appreciation of the things that defined him, including his chair. He also sort of had his favorite pen. He had, a particular count for his bed sheets. He had a particular count for his dhoti. So his seat, the Charukasala, was his seat. Now the Charukasala literally translates as reclining chair in Malayalam. The kasala, by the way, is a word that is derived from cadeira, which is the Portuguese word for chair. So the Charukasala was his seat, the chair he sat on every day in his front veranda, which I now tentatively occupy with none of the privilege that comes with it. It was the dignity and loftiness with which my grandfather assumed his seat that drew me and most of the village to his side over and over again. The chair upon which he sat, upon which he spent most of his day, was a standard issue teak and canvas seat. Every morning, a fresh white muslin towel was laid out. Every morning, he would pick it up, shake it out, use it to swat the chair assiduously, and stretch it as if to ensure symmetry, and lay it down with utmost precision before assuming his position on the veranda. It was a station of vantage and power, angled as it was to command a view of any approaches to the house or of any emerging from within. His percipience and his reputation for astute advice saw villagers seeking his darshan or counsel often. They were afforded positions determined by their social standing, across from him on seats much like his, benches with backs, benches without backs, stools, or none at all, where the more confident found spots on the inner or outer steps, and the less stood diffidently in the compound. On days when he was occupied elsewhere, the simple presence of the simple seat imparted the comfort of continuity, the reassurance of his gentle authority, and the conciliatory rhythm of routine. When he passed, the chair was folded and stored permanently. The void on the veranda echoed across the village. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarita, for that lovely story. And here also I would like to take an opportunity to invite you all to share your memories about the chair if you have any. So please do write to us at Godrej Archives. So it's archives@godrej.com. And if you have any memory about a chair, because we will be also launching, some of you might have seen this webpage called 100seatsofIndia.com in the exhibition area. And that's the website which will also give you a glimpses about this book and also the 100 seats that we have picked up. And so there will be also a blog where we will be collecting all these public memories about the chair. So please do share, because we need more and more stories from people, because that's what makes history more interesting. So now, without any delay, I would like to call upon all the panelists. Suchitra Subramaniam. She's an independent scholar and visiting professor of design based in Ahmedabad. So we would do a quick book launch, and Sarita, you have to again come up. Sandeep Sangaru, he is the founder of Sangaru Design Studio. Deepak Srinath, owner of the Phantom Hands. and also Mr. Kuldeepak Singh, who is the branch commercial manager of Godrej here in Bangalore. So I would like to invite every one of you to come here for the book launch. Sarita? So before I give a mic to Suchitra, who will be moderating the panel discussion, I'll just quickly introduce Suchitra. Suchitra Balsubramaniam is an independent scholar and visiting professor of design based in Ahmedabad, India. Her research interests center on 19th and 20th century craft and design in India against the backdrop of decolonization and nationalism. Her publications include The India-Pakistan Border as Site for the Production of National Identity, Heritage by Design, published in 2021, Moving Away from Bauhaus and Ulm in 2019, and Craft and Design in the Hindu Way of Life 2018, and she has many more as such. Her current research is about modern block printed textiles in Western India through two interconnected projects. The first is a biography of Manikal Gajjar, a textile block maker and master craftsman from Pithapur, Gujarat, supported by India Foundation for the Arts, Bangalore. The second project, supported by the Royal Ontario Museum, explores urban textile craft histories in India through an archive of over 7,000 hand-carved wooden blocks retrieved from a textile printing unit in Mumbai. Both projects challenge the association of block-printed Indian textiles with an unbroken past by uncovering their adaptive response to contemporary issues and their receptivity to global influence. And we thought Suchitra would be really great moderator for this panel, offer like really great experience in the design studies. So over to you, Suchitra.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Vrunda, for inviting me. It's a great chance to meet Sarita after a long gap of many decades, is it, Sarita? We studied together at the NID, but it was also a good chance to meet Deepak and Sandeep. And the conversations in the foyer before we came into the auditorium suggested that nobody needs introductions to nobody because everybody seemed to know one another outside, and there were animated discussions. But there may be a few of us who don't know each other so well. I just wanted to say a little bit more about myself. I studied exhibition design at the NID, where Sarita and I were almost contemporaries. And Sandeep came many years later, and I think Deepak is an honorary member of NID, being
by default. Yes.
by default. I think your wife studied there. So, because of this common institutional affiliation that we have, it's also, I feel like saying that we miss MP Ranjan a lot today. He was a beloved teacher of all of us, but more significantly for this book, for this occasion, he was a great mentor who encouraged us to look at the histories of design. He encouraged us to write. He encouraged us to pursue this interest, which was perhaps not very central to what we did at NID. And so for that, we miss him today because he would have celebrated this book and Sarita today. But I'm so glad that Aditi is here and perhaps even Appu with us. So I just wanted to say a little bit about that.
The book is dedicated to him, and I think of the various sort of rallying cries that he made. One, of course, was one that Sandeep followed, another that in terms of sort of get on the train and go to teach mechanical drawing, I think, was it? Yeah. And another was, I think, Suchitra to sort of look at design histories and theory. And for me as well, he was kind of keen to sort of get me to start working in this space.
Yeah. All of you know Sarita. She's trained as a graphic designer, but she also studied at Leicester University at the School of Museum Studies. She studied heritage and interpretation. And I think that has brought a quality to her graphic design practice, which included looking at archives, looking at heritage, interpreting it for contemporary audiences, and making it palpable and connectable to a sort of public, emerging, young, old, diverse public to engage with the past in various contemporary ways to make meaning of the past. She now runs a practice called Hanu, which works at the intersection of graphic interpretation, visual culture, museum studies, as well as research and writing and designing. Please add if and exhibition design. So that's the author whose book we are going to learn about more this evening. Sandeep Sangaru also is well known to all of you. He's a furniture designer. He has an mechanical engineering background. He works extensively in bamboo, but also in other materials. He has a multidisciplinary studio where he does a range of work in addition to furniture design, which includes films, and which is also a passion of his, and photography. He also says that he's a nomad, travels extensively. In fact, the last time we met was in Hangzhou, and we're meeting after that, after several years. His work has been collected by museums. They've been auctioned at Christie's. So he has this international kind of impact with his work, and it's great to have him here to discuss a book on seats and seating.
Which I came to know just recently was that he did his internship and a project at Godrej.
At Godrej?
I didn't know that.
Okay. So that's
my final project also.
So that's intertwined histories. And not the last or the least is Deepak Srinath. He is has a background in technology entrepreneurship, which he continues to stay with, I think. Or
No, not really.
No?
Completely got
Okay.
out of that
So
one.
the bio I got said that you still are a venture capitalist in that space.
It's all in the distant past.
Okay. So he runs this amazing furniture design and manufacturing company called Phantom Hands. And among other things, they are reviving and reimagining the chairs which were designed by Pierre Jeanneret in Chandigarh. It's what, 75 years since then, 60 years,
the
something
50s.
like that. So they are reviving the chairs, the Chandigarh chairs, and we'll know more about him and his work through the discussions this evening. Was there something I missed out?
Not really.
Okay. So I've had an activist practice. So I worked as a designer in social movements and then moved to academics and writing. So maybe some of that experience will kind of peep into the questions that I pose to all of us and join in the discussions. So I think we should start by congratulating Sarita. So congratulations on this amazing volume. It's an encyclopedic work, I think. And we can see from some of the chairs on display in the foyer, it's just a glimpse of the many, many kinds of objects that she's considered. And it's not only about chairs, as you must have realized. And she goes back into the prehistory of chairs in a way. and starts by looking at seating itself and all the kind of ramifications, the settings in which it happens, and so on. But rather than me speaking about it, I thought I'll ask Sarita to say a little bit about what it meant to do this research. Where did it take you? Who did you meet? What happened?
When I was speaking to Suchitra a while back about this, I ended up sort of telling her about some of the seats that didn't actually make it to this selection because there's so much. So in that sense, every time sort of someone says that it's encyclopedic, in a sense, it's not encyclopedic. I'm sure I've missed out a bunch. But for me, I think looking at archives is something that I've had the opportunity to do in a lot of various sort of projects that I've worked on. And I think the thing that really sort of has always interested me in the various sort of projects that I've worked on has been, and particular with this, has been that there are these absences in the archives. There are a lot of missing links. And as much as what is in the archives are of interest, it's also the things that one can't quite place or trace a sort of a narrative in it. So the attempt really has been in this project and a lot of others has been to sort of try and trace stories by looking at various sources. So one of the major sort of sources have been archives. The Godrej Archives was one of the major sources. The NID Archives was one. The MoMA, for instance. Other than that, there was a lot of oral histories and sort of talking to both practitioners, talking to manufacturers. They've also been sort of looking at secondary sources, so for instance, books and things like that. And what happens with the archives is that there's this sort of a seduction of sort of trying to find a story, and you almost think that there is a story there, and then you try and force fit it into. I can see Indira sort of nodding her head because we've discussed this often enough. When you find something, and then you try and sort of say, oh, there has to be a story here. And you kind of go on a trace and you try and find it. And in this particular case, for instance, there was this interest or a need to sort of try and find out where did the iconic Godrej chair, where was the inspiration for the Godrej iconic chair, the CH4, the CH8 and things. Obviously, most of us would sort of see a lineage going back to the Seska, which was in Master Brewers 1928 or 25 or so. And but was there an instance where there was a sort of an engineer from Godrej who went and picked up a sample, came here? Then I remember we've always had this exhibition at the National Institute of Design, which was which we used to call the prototype room, right? Which had a collection of chairs, objects that were actually part of objects that were part of an exhibition that traveled in the 1959, brought by MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art. It traveled into about 9 cities in India. We know from the archives of MoMA that there was a Seska chair there. There was no Seska chair and in the prototype room in NID. So I got very excited. I mean, maybe a Godrej engineer went to one of these exhibitions and stuff like that. Obviously, very, very quickly, that whole sort of trying to find a story fell flat because the dates just don't match at all. But what I'm trying to say is that I think projects like these have meant that one has sort of tried to find connections, and the connections have come from varied sources, conversations with people, and have tried to sort of trace all that together and then make a sort of a narrative. I think that's the and sometimes you actually come up with a conclusive end, which can be very satisfying, but the journey itself of looking is as exciting, I think.
Yeah, I'm also in the middle of doing detective work with Maniklal Gajjar's And I can tell you it's very exciting when you find one of the motifs somewhere in the UK and you start wondering how are things moving back and forth across the world. But that brings me, of course, to Deepak. You are reviving a French architect's designs for Chandigarh. I mean, the Corbusier came to design the buildings, but his cousin Pierre Jeanneret actually came and did furniture. Did he do architecture as well?
Yes, he did a lot of architecture
Yeah.
too.
And then, so tell us, what was the process? How did you find the chairs? How did you excavate them? Was it like an archaeological trip, or were they all around just waiting to be
Well,
reproduced?
I first came across a pair of Chandigarh chairs in 2014, and I knew very little about the chairs when I first saw them. But then I quickly became fascinated with the story of Chandigarh and how, how many designs were created for Chandigarh.
So how many?
I think there are, at least as per my knowledge, there are over 150, many of them undocumented. So it was an incredible story. And as I started digging deeper into the story, I figured out a few things. Firstly, it wasn't Jeanneret alone who created these designs. There was a team of Indian designers and architects, people like Aditya Prakash, Yuli Chaudhary, several others, model makers, all of them contributed to the design. So clearly Jeanneret, the design language came from sort of the French modernism, the French period of the designs they did in the 30s and 40s. But after that, a lot of Indians had contributed to that. And the narrative at that point was, it was all Jeanneret. I mean, credit must be given to Jeanneret, but it wasn't all Jeanneret. Secondly, it was the world's largest open source project at that time, perhaps the first open source project of its kind. And it was, the blueprints were freely distributed to several carpentry workshops with clear instructions that the maker could modify the designs as per their requirement or the site specifications.
So it's like democratizing
very
the
much,
design.
very much. And thereafter, the other thing, of course, at that point was the sort of fame, infamy, or notoriety that the vintage pieces had gained in the auction market, with crazy prices and all of that. But the one thing that stood out for me was that a lot of the vintage pieces were actually very poorly made. And I noticed that the pieces that were made in the 50s had a level of refinement and craftsmanship that kind of went away. And these pieces were made up until the 80s and then continued to be made in small quantities thereafter. But for me, what prompted me to explore making these pieces was the fact that the craftsmanship had kind of, diminished.
So that is one of yours, that chair?
Yes, that's
So,
one of ours.
Folks,
Yes.
that's one of the Chandigarh chairs. Tell
There's
us the
some
name.
more. There's some more in the front.
Yeah,
Some outside also.
that's the office chair. But,
Okay.
yeah, so that was that. And then pretty much like Sarita's detective work or research work, I spent the next 8 or 10 months on a trail that led me from Patiala and Chandigarh to Montreal, where the Jeanneret's archives were. And so I was fortunate enough to go to Montreal, be given access to the archives, and all the way to talking to Jeanneret's family. His niece was still alive at that point. And triangulate the whole thing and establish that they were indeed, the designs were indeed in the public domain and could be made. And that was the spirit and philosophy behind the collection. And therefore, in a small way, almost as a fun project, we started making these chairs, and now they've taken on a life of their own.
We also have a colleague, Mia Dandapani, who's also doing a project on looking at the Chandigarh project and the chairs that came out of it. I think maybe when we open up for the audience, you will please add some of your own research and your findings. So, Sandeep,
Can I have a question for Deepak, actually? Also, just to sort of go back, Nia was quite, it was very good to have Nia's back comments on a few of the early drafts and things like that, and course corrected me gently, because I also sort of I got caught up with the sort of romantic idea of Jeanneret wanting his ashes to be sort of put into the Chandigarh lake. And my narrative was sort of skewed a little bit towards giving him more credit than the other sort of team of architects and designers and craftsmen. So thank you for that, actually, Mia. But can I ask Deepak a question? Is this the right?
Of course.
Yeah. So I've always sort of wondered when looking at not people who sort of reproduce some of the mid-century sort of classics. We have you working with the Chandigarh chairs. We have a number of sort of designers re-looking at the Godrej chairs in Bombay. And I often wondered at which point does your sort of reproductions stay true to what was original? How, and I know that you've experimented and sort of slowly moved away. At what point does it sort of reach that ship of Theseus paradox statement of sorts? I mean, when does the chair sort of cease being that and just an inspiration? Because even I can see that the piece that's here of, say, the Godrej chair, and I've seen what Baro does in, have you seen what Baro does with the Godrej chairs? They kind of add a floral motif to the seat, or they sort of change the white plastic to cane. It's almost trying to domesticate this sort of office chair into usage in a home. But I'm curious to know where do you feel that this still is the Chandigarh library chair, and now that I've done so much more, it is it's an inspired Chandigarh chair.
Right. I think this question becomes a little more nuanced and complex for the Chandigarh chairs, because there is no definitive model for any particular chair. If you look at this office chair, there are about 15 variants of this that you'll find in Chandigarh. That said, exactly. So that said, the approach we took was we chose the optimum or the model that we liked best, or we found the most ergonomic in terms of which one we took to re-edit. We don't change the dimensions or proportions. What we allow ourselves to play with is the finish, and if it's an upholstered chair, the kind of fabrics that we use. So we do a lot of that. We don't change the dimensions, because then to us it moves away from the
So it's like
form and structure. Yes.
And not the sort of the outer
Yes.
surface treatment.
Yes. Yes.
I think one of the upholstered chairs is outside, so maybe on the way out, if you'd like to take a closer look,
And
it's
that
at the
for-
far end of the.
That's right. And that, for example, has a very experimental fabric. It's a patchwork fabric made of sort of upcycled fabric from the fashion industry. Yeah.
Shweta, there's one more after this, I think. Yes. Okay.
So I was thinking, Sandeep, you practice in a completely different setting. You're quite in a completely different material to what we have discussed so far. So working with bamboo, you've had a long experience with the material, though you do work with other materials as well. But I think of you as the one who does the bamboo furniture. How do you look at the issues of craftsmanship, community knowledge? Because after all, knowledge about bamboo, working with bamboo is held with communities, maybe Adivasi communities, who know the material, who know its properties, and you have collaborated with them. So how does that, can you say a little bit more about this design temperament and how it kind of encounters and collaborates with this setting in which your backgrounds and knowledge worlds are different, right?
Yeah. I studied furniture design, but I didn't practice it for almost 4 years after graduating. My question then was again, why another chair? There's so many already.
Yeah.
So I tried to kind of wanted to travel and explore and find myself out. And through that journey, Mr. Ranjan sent me to Tripura to work with bamboo artisans. And I had no clue about craftsmen or craftsmanship or bamboo as a material. And I learned from them. They told me about different species because I went there to teach them drawing, and I gave them a drawing to make a chair. So they said, okay, we'll use this species for the backrest, we'll use this species for the legs. And that's when I kind of figured out there is so much knowledge that they have. And when you're working with very basic tools, you're not thinking too much. You know you're constrained and you know what you're doing. And that was the point when I decided I want to explore working with craftspeople. And for almost 8 years, I traveled around the country working with different communities, trying to figure out what traditional practices are. And one thing I observed was what they make for themselves is very unique, because those things you don't get for yourself to buy or get it somewhere. And they're very functional objects which we don't see. And I thought, why not connect these and bring it back? And that's how it all started as a journey, and my collaboration with them. So every time I work with a new community, I go and inquire a bit to see what are the challenges that they face today and how I can, as a designer, contribute to that and see how we can translate that into something useful and valuable. Yeah, that's been the.
Actually, your descriptions made me wonder, because of my background in social movements and rights-based approaches and all. I sometimes worry about the asymmetries between designers and craftsmen, or craftspeople, craftspersons. And I wonder whether there is a class dimension to who becomes a designer and who is the craftsperson. These things sort of worry me internally. So I was wondering whether you have faced these kinds of feelings, or some kind of sense of appropriating people's knowledge into a designer object. Does this keep you alive? Awake at night, or how have you made peace with it? If you have, I sometimes still feel that thing inside. And how maybe later, Sarita, if this sort of stuff came up in the research and where it made you reflect on your own subject location vis-a-vis the material. So I don't know whether it's a hard question or an uncomfortable one, but if you could, just reflect a little bit, it would be.
Yeah, when I started interacting with craftspeople, of course, there was a gap. When you go as a designer and say, I'm going to design something new and that will bring you more and make your life better, it didn't work. I struggled a lot to break the ice and how to take it forward, because I was so fascinated of working with hands and the knowledge that I had. And in this inquiry between us, whenever I draw something and show it to them, they would say, Sandeep, ye mehenga ho jayega. This is going to be expensive. I said, then how can we push the craftsmanship? Because we are not pushing it. We are just trying to preserve it as an exotic art form rather than trying to take it to the next level. Then they would say, bikega nahi, bahut mehenga hai, koi kharidega nahi. So the whole idea is, that's how I started this whole company. Okay, can I connect the dots from the craftsman to the market? Design, make and sell. And that kind of engaged us in a better way. And they contributed more to the process of getting that product out in its full form. Otherwise, it becomes a very mediocre product, which we commercially produce to sell. So, yeah, I don't know if I could answer the question, but yeah.
There's no one answer, right? Yeah.
It's a fairly complex topic, Suchitra. I think in our case, today we have about 100 craftspersons in our workshop. I remember when we designed our first contemporary collection in 2017 with a Japanese Danish design duo who came and spent a month in our workshop working with the artisans. When the first prototype was ready, right? The carpenters who made them and the designer said, "Do you like it? Why don't you sit on it?" And there was so much hesitation to sit on a chair that they had made, and it was, for me it was very revelatory. I the issues of class and things like that, the way they see the things, that objects that they have created, it was very revealing to me. And then when we convinced them to sit on the chair and then they kind of therefore gave them a sense of ownership in the process, because it wasn't just the designer coming and telling them make this. Our designers were at every stage, they would ask them their opinion, and I think it was a completely new experience for them. And today we see a lot when there's a new design being prototyped. I think there's a strong sense of ownership in that process and product, but it's taken time to get there. Yeah.
It's a moving kind of moment, right? When a craftsman is unable to feel part of the product that he or she has created, or feels alienated from it. It makes us think as designers about what we are doing and how we are doing it. And I think as both your experiences suggest that there is a individual ethical way, and there could be multiple ways, as many as there are designers, to move towards addressing those asymmetries inside of ourselves and in the business, right?
Very much. But if I can just take a little bit of more on this topic, there is also equally a tendency to glorify craft or the craftsperson, I think, which also needs to be addressed, because in my own experience, it's a mixed bag like anything else, right? There are some of our craftspersons are extremely proud of the work they do and the work they do. So some others is just a job, and they're not really that invested in what they create. Also, to manage craft it has been quite complex for us. We've had to deal with all kinds of issues, from substance abuse to, we get involved in their family disputes. We're sort of the interlocutor in all kinds of things to help them manage their life. So it's a very complex interplay. It's not a straightforward black and white. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, it's complex and on a number of different axes, right? But just to get a glimpse of how we're all thinking about these kind of complexities was why I brought it up. Because I kind of live with it in the work that I do. I'm thinking about it, so I thought it would be nice to kind of reflect on it. Sarita, but does this come up in the research? Because you explored brass crafts, the people who weave chairs, the rattan weaver or the cane weavers. So it must have come up again and again, right?
Yeah, I think definitely this issue of sort of ownership, authorship has come up often enough. Like one thing that has sort of really brought it to light, for instance, is during the GoldenEye sort of project, where we had designers from international designers working with Indian designers, working with Indian craftsmen. Authorship was sort of very, very loosely defined. The Bellini bench is called the Bellini bench, while there was, craftsmen from Rajasthan and also from UP who worked on it. Kesaria Ram's name is very rarely mentioned, but he was critical in the sort of the way in which the stone was actually used eventually. I don't know if that image
Maybe
is
you
there.
can just say a little bit about GoldenEye.
So the GoldenEye project was one where conceived by Rajiv Sethi and a number of other sort of cultural patrons at that point, where they want, the primary, the aim was to sort of introduce the wonders of Indian crafts to the world. And the best way at that point was to sort of get international designers to work with Indian
And this was in the
designers.
1980s.
80s, 84. And so there were international designers who were very well sort of established already. And for them to sort of communicate with the craftsmen at that point, they were routed through a set of sort of Indian designers. Chandra Vijay Singh would have been senior to you, I think, helped Bellini translate his drawings onto to Kesaria Ram, and created this Bellini bench, which is a sort of a huge bench made out of stone. Today, that bench is sold again at various sort of auction sites and at an incredible price. There is no authorship there. But what I have found, at least when speaking to a lot of sort of designers, recent designers, for instance, Ranjan Bodoloi, who's a Pitoloi bench, stool you'll see up front, very close to the door. He worked with Imam Ali, who's a brass worker from Assam. He did this project as a student, and he was very, very particular about giving credit to Imam Ali when he won the Red Dot Award. When today he's showing at the Capellini Next in Milan and things like that. So there is a consciousness, and it's not there across. In the book itself, what you will see is I've sort of juxtaposed sort of situations together. I haven't sort of tried to sort of make a judgment about it, but I've sort of juxtaposed opinions from various people. We have, I think, this one's a New York Times sort of quote where these questions were raised at that point. So it wasn't something that wasn't raised. These were questions that were raised. Notwithstanding that, things still continue to move on. So
I thought maybe we can just take a break in this my asking questions kind of thing. And I know, Sandeep, you had some questions for Sarita, right? About Indianness and those kind of...
I've been wanting to find the answer for myself for a very long time, since I discovered design and studied design, and still trying to find one. So my question is, since you've done such an intensive research for the book, and you have categorized them in different ways, was there any common denominator where you could say there is a certain sense of language of what can be called Indian design or Indian design? Is it?
I think this sort of search for Indianness in various disciplines has been sort of going on, right from Ramanujan's sort of famous paper, Is There an Indian Way of Thinking? So what is it that makes anything Indian, for that matter? And I've addressed it a little better in graphic design, in a sort of a paper I'd written on graphic design than I have, I believe, here, where I felt that there is, the paper is called Indians Don't Like White Space. So it sort of talks about our sort of tendency towards a multiplicity, a certain of communication. So there's a layeredness, and there's a sort of moving away from singularity in communication. So for instance, precision in certain ways of communication, or at least singularity is not, the lack of singularity, let's say, is, I felt, a sort of emblematic of Indianness in communication. One of the reasons why I've sort of called this book From the Frugal to the Ornate has been because across the various sort of geographies, across the various histories that I've looked at, as well as across the various types of functions, an object could either be frugal or ornate, and it somehow manages to fulfill those functions. So you have the Naga throne. You might have seen the versions of the Naga throne. A Naga throne is just carved out of wood. It's a throne, but there's no jewelry. There's no gemstones. There's no rich carving. And it's still a Naga stone. It still manages to command sort of power. Gandhiji's Baitak, in all its simplicity, managed to sort of command power and sort of bring people down to sort of speak to him. Englishmen had to sit uncomfortably in their suits and boots and sort of sit with him, and he wielded power with that. You have forms of frugal patlos. In Malayalam, we call it palagyas. You have ornate palagyas, and we've got two of these luckily out front. When it becomes ornate, it is emblematic of a particular ritual sometimes. It is emblematic of a ceremonial use at most. We've got frugal expressions in the neo-modern designs of today. And you have ornate ones as well. So I think the idea of sort of ornament being sort of emblematic of Indian design is something that at one point was thought of, anything that's ornate. And indeed, when in the West, when people would look at the Bombay Blackwood furniture, which is very, very richly ornate, they sort of said these are the imaginings of a Hindu mind, which would sort of move without being still, in a sense. That was one of the sort of descriptors of a Bombay Blackwood furniture. But you have at the same time very, very sort of, there is an aesthetic, which I think to a large extent, Sandeep, you've sort of tried to sort of bring out, which I've sort of called at various points a certain spiritual aesthetic, which meant sort of a simplicity of form, a sort of unity of sort of language and material. And that can also sort of be as Indian as the Channapatna work, which sort of sparkles and glints, So.
Any reactions to that, Sandeep? Or would you like to add something to it from your travels, your experiences?
Yeah, because I work with traditions, and I'm on a line where I want to kind of say, because if I'm working with a traditional craft, there is so much that is associated with that practice. So trying to say, okay, if I'm making a Channapatna chair or a Kashmiri chair, how does I make it Kashmiri but still make it contemporary? Trying to balance that and trying to find a way that it stands out for the space and the people that make it.
Yeah,
So there's always been
the question of identity is also quite
it's a
complex one, right?
I recently I follow Manu Chandra, the chef, the Bangalore chef. Okay, so he did something where he took biryani and tried to make it look like sushi, and he sort of and he says on his Instagram post, he sort of says that there has to be this balance, or you have to sort of know when you marvel and then when you get into the outraging territory, So a biryani can go really wrong, I suppose, if you sort of, have a bite of it and it hits you. So that's something I always wanted to ask when you sort of work with craft and you do it with where you kind of work with the everyday and yet you keep the distance of the myth, in a sense. Again, to sort of quote a Peter Brookes theatre person's sort of idea of how do you sort of take something that's ordinary, like bamboo, and then create something that's at the same time quite mythical, like the larger trust me sort of activities. So you've taken an ordinary material and then kind of made it into.
I don't have an answer for that. But I think when you're working with a material, with a tool, the way you transform it to a shape, it gives you a direction to kind of, okay, I can be molded in this way and can be taken up. And when I was working in Northeast, it's a way of life for them. Living with the bamboo as a material. It's the houses, the bridges, everything is made out of bamboo. And for them, or what I observed was there was no distinct character that like could define like Channapatna or Kashmir, where is a very strong visual language. In bamboo in the northeast, there was no strong. It was weaving, and it was just bamboo in its natural form. So I was fascinated by the material itself, and since they were comfortable working with it and molding it to whatever they want, gave me the flexibility to experiment and push the expression a little more wilder. That's how it came about.
I think this question sort of, where does outrage stop and, or where does marvel stop and become outrage is something that sort of.
Is there anything Indian about the Chandigarh chairs? Or is there anything French about the Chandigarh chairs?
It's
you think?
perfect hybrid, right? The materials, the craft, all of it is extremely Indian. And I think Corbusier famously, as Sarita I think mentioned in her book, he was not a fan of handcrafted making at all. He believed that industrial production was the way to go. Ironically, all the chairs in Chandigarh are handmade using very traditional Indian craft and materials. So, I would say they're very much set in the context of the place and time in which they were made.
So you mean the question of Indian and French really doesn't arise in a way?
Yeah.
I mean,
all of it is hybrid. Indian furniture history is essentially hybrid, I feel.
Good point. I was just wondering whether, some of you might like to come in with some questions, because we've opened up a few directions in the discussion, whether something comes to mind. Would you like to pose a question to any of the panelists? Sorry?
Ergonomics study very formally came in again mid 19th century or so, 20th century or so, in a formal way. So both at the National Institute of Design, at the Godrej sort of factories as well, in a formal way, it was at that point. But I think inherently in a lot of the sort of traditional Indian designs that we see, there is a sort of an understanding of body posture, ways of sitting, clothes. I think we were discussing at one point about clothes and, so for instance, when you're wearing, you can't wear a tight pair of jeans and sit on the ground, for instance, so there are a lot of sort of factors other than sort of body sort of structure and form and shape. Yeah. Indra.
Somewhere. Okay. So my question is really concerning memory, time, materiality. So, when you look at the shape of chairs, the material that is used, the posture, I'm just wondering how you situate it. Is it, does it belong to the past, the present? What kind of form, what kind of relationship, that you see there? Did this come across to you as you looked at the history of chairs? And I put that question also to the other panelists who have been working with things where the material might belong to the past, the posture in which you sit might belong to something else, and then it's being made into something in the present. So I had a hybridity kind of question, but it's also, really about how these things interact. Thank you.
No, I think that's an interesting question because at one point, the book, and I've sort of noticed it as well, is that some people do look at not just the sort of the memory of the material or the memory of structure, but also the memory of gait and posture. So, for instance, you're sort of trying to sort of recreate gait and posture and your relationship with things around you, rather than saying that and most of us will always look at the past as a form of inspiration. So, not just saying that this is how craft has dealt with a material, or this is the structure from the past, but look at how just the relationship of the body to what's around you. So, for instance, if you look at that, the way in which we sit has changed. I mean, we've been constrained by the chair, which, like Sandeep says, do we need another one? But there have been attempts recently where people are sort of either trying to recreate postures through the objects that they create. So postures that allow for freedom, for lack of restriction, for being able to sort of move and do different activities. On a chair, you can sit and read and write. But when you're on the ground, you can do a few multiple things at the same time. And there have been people who've sort of recently who've sort of worked on the new types of postures that have started to come because of our relationship with our phones and our computers and stuff like that. So, yeah, you can see some of those at the end of the book. But, yeah.
Do you like to come in on that question, either of you?
I think on the material part, for example, teak is so, it's Indian furniture, at least good Indian furniture is so strongly associated with teak. And something that we are grappling with is teak is fast becoming an endangered species. It's, you don't necessarily get it from certified sources and things like that. But if we therefore started making, let's say, the Chandigarh collection in a wood that's not teak, would it be the same? Because so much of your memory is associated with the material there. So, yeah, I don't have an answer, but it's something that we are also grappling with.
Sandeep, any thoughts?
I think material gives the shape, and of course, when you're designing a chair, your body is the main thing that interacts with it. And like some chairs I work with is solid wood, and they look very hard and uncomfortable to view. But the whole idea is, if you sit on it, how does it feel? So the material gives you a certain way of treating it. So it kind of creates a new language if you try to do it properly, instead of trying to be very rigid with 4 legs and a backrest, which is very basic. But yeah, then the expression comes through it. And that's what is exciting in the process of making a chair or a furniture.
There was someone at the back who wanted to. Yes. Yeah. Hold on.
Hello. So my question is, whenever the role of a designer comes into craft, does it always end up pushing it in terms of affordability and to the more upper strata of the society? Or is there anything for the middle class or the lower income group to benefit from it?
Craft is very accessible to all of us. You can actually go to a craftsman and make one for yourself, right? But a craftsman cannot come to you. So as a designer, I've been trying to explore the possibility if we can connect the dots from there to the people. I don't know if this is an answer, but I guess it's not about making something very expensive or very affordable. But the whole idea is, over the period of time, over generations, the craftsmanship has deteriorated. Like as Deepak just mentioned, the Chandigarh chairs, over a period of time, the craftsmanship dissipated. Even it happens in our traditional crafts, because they are getting mere amounts to produce that. So the effort that they put into it is also very less. Now, how do we shift that before it disappears? So we have to challenge ourselves and craftspeople and their knowledge. Can we take it to the next level? And if you want to do that, it goes higher, right? If you want to buy organic vegetables today, they're more expensive than the farm vegetables. So it's a similar thing. So till we have many craftsmen practicing the craft, the value of it won't be very competitive.
There's another question.
I just want to sort of focus on the title that we had given for the talk today. And I was very curious when we said frugal to ornate. Is there a conversation around the politics of the designer and the presence of the designer in the way furniture and objects have grown through overpast? I mean, we've talked about it, architect's presence, we've talked about artist's presence. Does the authorship and the agency move on to the user? When does that happen? When we study the timeline and the map?
Completely sure about your question. Like, when does the authorship move in terms of history?
Authorship of the user, when does that start picturing in? Whether it's in the form of history or in the form of contemporary practices, or does the agency always remain what the designer thinks happens?
So the very sort of definition of the word vernacular inherently means made by and for the people often. So rather than using the word traditional, when you sort of look at the word vernacular, it is often of the language of the people, so to speak. So
But isn't that also a very colonial term?
as a term, quite likely. But if you think of it as a sort of the concept itself, concept of the vernacular means that, like for instance, the craftsmen that Sangaru was sort of works with, they've made their baskets and their modas for themselves. They were never making things for somebody else. They were made for them to sit on. And even today, most sort of, there's still a lot of sort of craft, whether it's quilt or sort of furniture, that is made for use within your own home and maybe as a means to sort of barter. And I think it is when that sort of shift moves from maybe the vernacular, colonial term as it may be, to sort of outside, that's when sort of the relationships and the hierarchies come to play. Don't know if that answers or at least sort of brings up some questions.
Yeah, I think it's just beginning.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions.
Yeah, sorry, there's somebody here.
So going back to the moment you were talking about the hybrid design, in times like these where internet is showing us quite a bit of images, as a designer, how do you deal with not being too hybrid, you're not being influenced with whatever you have seen? How do you design something that you feel is still original and not based on what you have seen through the internet? Or
This is for Sandeep.
He sort of knew that was for him, so he's sort of looking at the side.
I guess nothing is original. There is always inspiration for something or the other. Nothing comes out of just blank things. So I guess, and it are memories, it are experience that reflect onto what we create or write or read or whatever. So I guess there's no definite answer. Yeah, nowadays we get to see a lot more. And that also becomes a challenge while you're designing something new. Okay, am I trying to replicate something or I'm trying to create something original? And it's upon you to take a call whether you want to take inspiration from that and take it to the next level. Because if I'm taking inspiration, I want to push it to the next rather than just trying to to it, because there could be many ways one could interpret that. But I guess originality has never existed. It's always been inspired from something or the other which comes out.
But can I come in on this? You know, my experience with working on the archives of Maniklal Gajjar, he's a textile block printer. There's one motif which I found in the work of textile designers pair. They were sisters called Sarah Campbell and Susan Collier. So when they adapted a motif from the Kashmir shawls, they call it inspiration. And when the same thing comes back and we see it in Maneklal's archive, it's like plagiarism. So the same thing in two different directions has two different terms. So Collier and Campbell have copyright, which they can then assert, right? So then Maneklal or whoever commissioned the work from him cannot be inspired, right? Then it's copyright infringement. But in the other direction, it's inspiration. So there is a politics here which needs to be kind of explored, and what exactly are the asymmetries in this needs to be talked about some more and aired some more. There's no one kind of way of it, but it comes up again and again, the question that you posed in our work.
I mean, you research so many chairs. It's such a great book, and it's a lush book. I'm looking forward to reading it. Obviously, you would have eyes on many chairs. Why did you choose the chair that you have on your cover? And also, who's designed the book cover?
Georgie Paul has designed the book cover. This is not a real chair. So the idea was that when we were sort of thinking about what to put on the cover, idea was to sort of take the theme that's followed through in the book, which is to deconstruct the chair and sort of to try and seek out what is the meaning of the chair. So which is why this is a sort of a amalgam of various elements. So that's what it is. It'll be very difficult to sit on a chair that looks like this. There's nothing else.
Yeah.
Devoid of hybridism in that sense. It's used for social interaction. It's used for so many, and it's very Indian in that context. Another thing I wanted to say is Upadhyay's name has not been brought up even once.
It's there in the book a lot, a good amount.
No, actually, since the issue of the design of the book came up, there are 3 essays at the end which kind of complement Sarita's work. And one is by Sujata Shankar Kumar, which talks about the NID chairs. And it looks at Upadhyay's work, Gugello's work, Rolf Missel also perhaps. So all the NID chairs. There's another essay by Lakshmi Subramaniam, the historian, who talks about the Godrej,
the
various chairs that Godrej has produced. And there's a third essay by Abigail McGowan, which, roughly speaking, focuses on the environments and interiors in which...
of early sort of 20th century.
Early 20th centuries, in which settings these chairs and various furniture and furnishings are situated. So,
and the shift in the
thanks
relationship.
For bringing up that, because we were kind of veering towards discussing the other aspects of the book which complement Sarita's research. Would you say a little bit about how you invited these people to contribute their essays?
Just before that, I'll just address Sanchita's sort of question about the charpai. For instance, when I I had a couple of conversations with Gio. Gio was considered the father of furniture design in India. And one of the first few things he talked to me about was how he learned how to weave the charpai. And he really explained to me. I had gone there with Ravinder Kharab, who studied under him, and I sort of wanted to also see the relationship between sort of student and teacher at that point, and observe that. So he spoke about learning how to weave a charpai, interestingly. So that what I found is that the charpai and the muda are the most sort of basic forms of elevated seat in India. There are a lot of other forms of sort of seating in India which have existed for a very long time. And those are the ones that have lent themselves most to sort of redesign and appropriation in its ugly sort of nuance, but also in other ways. And you see sort of versions of them where, again, at what point does the charpai not become a charpai and moves on to another thing? What time where does the muda become sort of a stool and no longer a muda? So there's sort of thing there. Coming back to sort of your question about the three people, it's an awkward mixing in terms of sort of structuring an essay, a set of essays. I mean, there are 8 essays that I wrote, which were primarily had some sort of a thread that I've put together. There were gaps that I found in that sort of structuring, and I found that these were people who had an expertise and a sort of a nuanced understanding that I would only replicate, but not sort of bring anything particularly original of my own. And that's how sort of I requested them to sort of contribute, and I feel they've really added a dimension and a depth that I wouldn't have been able to. So it's even though from a sort of a design of a book perspective or structure, it's a sort of awkward thing. There's 8 essays and then there are these 3 contributing essays.
Yeah. But one thing I've been itching to ask, and maybe it's occurred to some of you, how are chairs named? They have odd names sometimes. They are named after people, they're named after places, they have just numbers. Did you come up with, some kind of pattern? Is there some pattern here? Sandeep, how do you name your chairs? Is it like, my only association is with naming children, naming pets. There is all this emotion involved in thinking of a name, right? Does that happen? The chairs are your babies, or how does it? Well, I was curious about it.
Yeah, we named them. Initially, when I started, we were numbering them. I started numbering them like any other chair one. Then there were so many chair numbers. I thought then we should give some distinctive names. So I would ask, how does it look like, the form, to anyone around? And they would say, okay, it looks like an animal, or like a fox, or a giraffe, or a horse. So we just name it like that, okay? It's like a workhorse, it's a table. And fox is a chair, and it's in the bamboo collection. Even like that in Chennapatna chair that we make, we call it flame back. It's the name of a bird. Similarly, it kind of resembles something.
I think of that as the Game of Thrones chair. I cannot think of it. I've always, within ourselves, whenever we've spoken, we thought of that as the Game of Thrones chair.
How do you name your chairs?
So we've, again, been very creative. So we have Kannada names for all our chairs. So the first first collection that we did, the contemporary collection, was during the monsoons, early monsoons are designed. And so we call it the Mungaru chair. Mungaru is the cool monsoon breeze in Kannada. So, nice. And then this subsequent next collection was called the Tangali. So we were on this wind and cool breeze theme, and we stuck with that. Tangali and so on. Now we're actually, we mentioned a giraffe. So we are a new prototype which we haven't revealed. It looks a bit like a crocodile. So we're calling it a we wanted to call it a crocodile chair, then we said we'll name it and continue with the Kannada tradition. So we're calling it the Mosele chair. Mosele is crocodile in Kannada. So.
Okay.
So that's identity issue for you.
There are a couple of sort of chairs here that you might find it have interesting names. For instance, the Ponty stool. Is John still here? John's there. And John, maybe you should tell the story of the Ponty stool. Oh, come on. We all know what the reason is.
No, it was inspired by the form. I mean, I was referring to the violinist, jazz violinist, Jean-Luc Ponty. And when I designed that stool, I thought it looked like a person playing a violin. So that's how the name came up. And when Ponty was performing in Bangalore, I ran with the stool backstage and got him to sign on it. So the name stuck.
Did it get signed?
Pardon?
Did you manage to get it signed?
Yes, I did. But it was kind of complicated carrying this thing backstage, you know.
Good question. With names, there's a mythology that gets built around names, so no one knows the true story. But I think broadly, I don't know if few of you may know, but Phantom Hands didn't start off as a furniture making outfit. We started as a marketplace for vintage objects. Find interesting vintage objects, curate them, and make them, and then we wouldn't know who made any of these beautiful objects that we were, restoring and selling. And so a play on that, that's how Phantom Hands, because we didn't know who made these objects. And then when we moved to making furniture, we continued with the same name. We thought it was apt because, in a way, we now knew who was making them, and we kind of take care that, we mention our artisans' names wherever possible. But it's still, all of them come from communities which have been practicing the craft for generations. So in some way, it's the skill that's been passed on. So several Phantom Hands have worked on the object that you're seeing today. So that's how the name came.
Yeah, Mia.
Thanks. So my question kind of follows up, I think, from the questions about the title and frugal design and about sort of ownership. And I've been really lucky to sort of read a couple of the chapters. And so I know that part of the book looks at the Mont Blanc chair, or the sort of white plastic, ubiquitous kind of plastic chair. And so I guess I'm interested in sort of hearing your reflection on how that fits into everything that's been discussed in the way I think it sort of veers away in an interesting way. I'm also interested, given that there's a designer and a maker who's looking at kind of reproducing what was once mass-produced furniture, how a chair like that, how do we understand a chair like that in terms of design, and in terms of design and taste, and what gets to be revived? Are we going to see sort of 50 years from now, the Mont Blanc, the white plastic chair being rethought, or is there something particular about that chair and it's kind of ubiquitous everyday nature that means it's different in some way?
So the monoblock chair, I think we can't possibly, Mia's referring to the common plastic chair that we see everywhere. We can't possibly sort of ignore it. And I think it's very sort of ubiquitousness that gives it its power, because you can see it quite comfortably in a museum. I mean, I've seen it at the NGMA, and I've used one of those images of the white plastic chair in a museum with, high art in the background on the walls. You see them on the streets. And what I found interesting was one that because of its very everyday nature, there was a certain poetry that could be found in the way in which it was everywhere. And I've sort of shown some images of photographers who found it, who've documented the plastic chair on Instagram. And there are Flickr groups now, which sort of are called the white chair, the white plastic chair. I do know that one of the designers whose work I've featured in the book, Ajay Shah, has been sort of saying that he would like to make the Indian plastic chair, because you can't sort of ignore the fact that it is so inexpensive and it has managed to sort of replace the other vernacular sort of furniture like the modas and the benches and charpais. You see them in villages and everywhere. So I don't, and the reason why it found its place in the book is because I don't think we can afford to ignore something like this. We can hate it, but we can't really ignore it.
Yeah, maybe we'll take one or two more questions. I've just been told that we are kind of reaching the end of our discussion, but we can perhaps continue later. But yeah, please go ahead.
At what point? Yeah, again, a follow-up question on the idea of the vernacular. At what point do we ignore the impracticability of foreign design chairs in a country like India? Furniture is something that we use every day. It has practical implications in all of our lives, right? And different furniture from across the globe is designed keeping things in mind. For example, the weather, the environment in a place. The furniture that you see in the West is particularly suited for how the physique of people from the West, or the weather over there, or various different reasons. So how would we approach a chair like the Chandika chair that was designed by a foreigner? What reasons do we have for continuing that design in a country like India? And why would we continue to explore Western designs in a country like India? Again, to follow up on the idea of the vernacular, it is using materials, using designs, using the culture that we find in a particularly locally sourced area, right? So why look outside for solutions that could be more cheap, more or less expensively, easier and better operated from a local environment?
But there are sort of various instances today that you see of people working with Indian material, Indian techniques, and both the work that Deepak and Sandeep are doing are sort of reflective of that. So the Chandika chair, as we were sort of saying, it's not necessarily designed entirely by a foreigner. I mean, it does use Indian material and Indian sort of techniques as well. So I don't think it's true that we are only sort of looking to the West in that sense.
Yeah, sorry, that wasn't my intention, but my intention was more at what point do we stop looking outside, and what point, where's the tip line where we're betraying too much of our own culture and looking too much outside rather than staying true to what's locally sourced? Because there is a problem when we look too much outside with regards to the sustainability of it, with regards to how much it costs,
totally.
So on and so forth. So I think my question is more, at what point is it too much?
To look outside, you see?
Yeah. Maybe a question more to the people actually involved in the industry.
I don't know. I mean, personally, I don't. So I don't have. I mean, I don't really think about. It's what is outside, what is inside. I mean, it's at its very core. I think craft is Indian. I think that's that to me, at least as far as our practice goes. The fact that the way we make it, the craft that we use is fundamentally Indian. We will not kind of, and that has to be made within you. That to me, as far as design is concerned, I think there is a certain universality today. I mean, when you look at a chair is a chair, in that sense, sure. I mean, of course, for example, when we work with European designers, one of the challenges that we see is that they tend to make the designs for much taller European bodies. For example, that could be a case where those certain pieces may not necessarily work for India or for an Indian user. And those are interventions that we as a maker either give in terms of feedback to, if we're working with a European designer from outside India. That's the kind of intervention that we give to help them adapt their design to an Indian audience. But yeah, I mean, that's my take on it. Sandeep, do you have any? I mean, I guess Sandeep is the perfect example of designed in India, made in India, completely in India. So,
but chair is still a stage. So
I think there's. Please go ahead.
I just want to add to what he was saying. He said something very important. He used the word climate that hasn't come into the discourse. Deepak said something interesting about monsoon and wind. And I think those are such important parameters that very few designers really, because they're intangible. It's not material, it's not tactile, it's not something you can hold. And I look at these two chairs and I then beg to differ with you, Deepak, that a chair is not a chair, because these two chairs are, there's a sort of contradiction in terms. The Chandigarh, both of them have been inspired by, well, we use the word foreigners here, Jollaway and Roya. One chair I would sit comfortably in because it will breathe. The other one, I need an air-conditioned space. Otherwise, I'll always be doing that. And the story goes that many years ago, my grandfather's chair was brought by my father to Bangalore from the Konkan coast. It was in tatters. So the architect designer that I said, look, let's put leather. So I still have the leather on it. But now I'm taking it back to Goa, and I have to strip the leather because the best material for Goa is cane. So I think the idea which he brought out about climate and your monsoon and the winds is such an important part. Of course, well, I gave away that I'm an architect. It's not just architecture. I think it's furniture as well.
No, that's true. Like getting back to grandfather's chairs, and we started with it. His use of the cloth was ideal because it could be washed. So, sweat, everything. He could have it crisp if he washed it every 2 days.
It's incredible. I am doing exactly that with my grandfather's chairs at this moment. So my uncle who inherited them removed the cane and got upholstered seating done. It's a beautiful old, classic cane chair. So I have now inherited it and I'm restoring it back to its cane original. So yeah. I actually think that it's interesting because, when I was reading the book, I realized that Godrej started industrial manufacturing in the 1920s. So this very question has probably existed for 100 years. This debate about what is craft, what is industrial, and impact, yes.
So that very exhibition, Frugal actually brought up these very questions, when we were looking to the West, like you said, in that exhibition that sort of came. There was a sort of introspection, even though she was key in bringing it. She said that we do have to consider what this means, because we are sort of bringing in objects that have been sort of industrially produced, and we have to remain conscious of it. Even though she was sort of key to bringing in the whole exhibition, and she brings it up in that I think it's in one of the slides here, actually.
But also 100 years on, both craft and industrial production continue to coexist, and I suspect they will, for a long time. So.
Okay, I think just as we are warming up to the really important questions, they've turned the ACs off and we are winding up.
Lights into the audience.
The lights are being turned off. So I'm so sorry that we'll have to continue this discussion perhaps outside and over dinner or something like that. But thank you very much for your questions, and thanks Sarita, congratulations again, and Deepak and Sarita for challenging Sarita with your own questions, and all of you, thanks very much.